As we have explored so far into the series, the status of horror games in the gaming industry has had an interesting story. Previously, the restrictive technology of the 2D landscape had made it difficult for games to truly embody horror. 2D games weren't nearly immersive enough for true horror to shine through, with the exception for a few games. However, once the PlayStation came onto the scene, horror games were able to revolutionize the entire genre, setting up the 6th generation of horror to become the true golden age of survival horror. Nevertheless, like every story, there must be a downfall, and with the horror genre, it was the 7th generation. The Xbox 360, the Nintendo Wii, and the PlayStation 3 were all consoles that had truly modern capabilities in both hardware and software to possess new levels of fear within players. Well, maybe except for the Wii. The 7th generation may have had some of the most mediocre horror games, but it also possessed some of the best the genre has ever seen. So we have to ask ourselves, what happened during this generation that made these games so lackluster? Has the genre made a comeback since then? Allow me to explain the 7th generation of horror in video games. To begin, let us take a deeper look at what made the previous generations so great when it came to horror. One important aspect was the difficulty. In Resident Evil 2, you had to manage your resources methodically, or else you would potentially lose up to 30 minutes up to an hour of progression. Hell, it's not even up to you sometimes. Even if you were prepared, you could still lose your progress in a flash. Secondly, the previous gen systems also embodied a real fear of the unknown. When we sat inches from our 480p TVs and squinted at some of the monsters with these low poly graphics, we usually had to fill in the blanks. On top of that, games like Silent Hill brilliantly used the primitive draw distance. That way players really had no clue what would be lurking around the corner unless they used the radio, which uses this nauseating sound that can annoy the player, making them feel various levels of stress and discomfort. Some would say that these elements are what made horror games so good back then. They fully embodied what it meant to be bound or helpless. When it comes to horror games, less is more. Starting with the 6th gen, we saw facets of player empowerment, especially within titles like Resident Evil 4 and Silent Hill 4. Survival horror during this time was still scary, but there was a trade-off. As technology advanced, the gaming industry found that a linear cinematic approach, as well as aspects of action-oriented mechanics, to be more enticing for the general gamer, and consequently increased sales revenue. The soul of horror may have been lost during this evolution of development, but I will hold off this judgment until we look more closely at the next generation. Kicking off that generation was the Xbox 360. When you think of best consoles of all time, you might think, oh, PlayStation 2 or SNES. But arguably, it could be stated that the Xbox 360 is the best video game console of all time, at least for now. It was the home for a plethora of fantastic video games to live on, such as Skyrim, Mass Effect, Arkham Asylum, and of course the Xbox exclusive Halo 3. One could argue that Halo 3 propelled online multiplayer to new heights in and itself, bringing players together in a way that had never been seen before. In comparison, Sony's lackluster reveal of the PS3 conjoined with the developmental difficulty of their console's hardware made the Xbox 360 an obvious choice for the casual gamer. While the 360 may have had genre-defining titles, there was one noticeable genre that was lacking. The following games on the Xbox 360 may not be your average cookie-cutter horror game, but there was no shortage of horror within these games. To begin, let us look at Monolith Productions' Condemned. Published by Sega in 2005, Condemned takes place in the fictional American town of Metro. In this setting, players take the role of Ethan Thomas, a crime scene investigator for the FBI. Well, that is until he's framed for murder. Along Ethan's journey, we explore several condemned buildings as we search for the one who framed Ethan for murder, the evasive serial killer X. Along the way, Ethan must use his investigative intuition, as well as the technology at hand, to examine evidence left behind by serial killer X, all the while fighting off the violently psychotic denizens of Metro City. Monolith cited such films as The Silence of the Lambs, Seven, and Saw as direct inspiration. The game is popular amongst critics, with the average consensus dubbing it as a good game, but many found it to be a disappointing showcase of next-gen hardware. Despite this, however, Condemned was found to be a truly horrific horror game, setting the stage for the next generation of its genre. After Criminal Origins, the game was followed up by a sequel entitled Condemned 2: Bloodshot in 2007. Condemned 2, while still good, sold less than anticipated. One of the developers cited the game's commercial failure as to be a result of the multiplayer craze that was invasive during this generation, a topic I will elaborate on later.
Clean it up! Clean it up! Typical behavior for some...
Almost single-handedly revolutionizing the video game industry in and itself, Bioshock is a brilliant example of a nearly perfect video game. While many may not consider it a horror game per se, it cannot be disputed that this game utilizes horror elements masterfully. In fact, its sprinkling of dread and trepidation is one of the many facets that makes this game so wonderful. Bioshock was created by Irrational Games in 2007, but at the time they released the game under the name 2K Boston. Irrational had previously been known for their sleeper hit System Shock 2, a PC-exclusive 1999 action role-playing survival horror game. Bioshock is set in 1960 and follows Jack, a silent protagonist who discovers the underwater city of Rapture. Built by business guru Andrew Ryan, Rapture was to be an isolated utopia, where the great would not be constrained by the small. The game most notably incorporates the beliefs of author Ayn Rand, who is known for developing the philosophy of objectivism. The discovery of Adam, a genetic material which grants superhuman powers, initiated the city's turbulent decline. Jack attempts to escape, fighting Adam-obsessed enemies and Big Daddies, while engaging with few sane humans that remain. The game includes elements of an RPG, giving the player different approaches in engaging enemies, such as by stealth, as well as moral choices of saving or killing characters. Additionally, the game and its biopunk theme borrow concepts from the survival horror genre, notably from Resident Evil. Bioshock was not only integral to the horror genre because of its disturbing nature, but it was also innovative in its commentary on the video game medium, telling a story that can only be experienced by playing it. Bioshock received universal acclaim, and was particularly praised by critics for its narrative, subject matter, visual design, setting, and gameplay. It is considered to be one of the greatest video games ever made, and a demonstration of video games as an art form. But if you want to know more about that, as well as my opinions on the game, might I recommend my Interpreting Bioshock video that I did with my brother, where we delve deep into the game's history and the game itself. Next up to bat was Remedy Entertainment's Alan Wake, an action-adventure game that released exclusively on the Xbox 360 in 2010. After wrapping up the first two Max Payne games, Remedy was in dire need of a break, especially after the crunch they endured while developing the aforementioned games. Their idea of a break was to brainstorm new video game ideas. Now, that's a break I can respect. Influenced by the work of Stephen King as well as David Fincher, Remedy wanted to adapt the episodic storytelling of his television drama into a video game, basing the entire story on one concept. Alan Wake, as a successful writer, finds himself in the small town of Bright Falls, where due to supernatural events, his writings have come alive to attack him. Everything pertaining to Alan Wake was to be the antithesis of Max Payne, not a badass cop, a troubled author, not a linear story, a more open world. Written by Sam Lake, Alan Wake took over 5 years to create. As stated before, the game was originally developed as an open-world survival horror game, but struggled over 3 years in merging the gameplay with the action thriller story they wanted to tell. After an intense 2-month period, the team reworked the game to be a more traditional, linear game broken into an episodic approach, which better supported the planned narrative structure. Alan Wake was revered upon launch, with many citing its wonderful story, flawless pacing, and incredible atmosphere as to be something unfadedly next generation. But once again, it wasn't a truly holistic survival horror game. It was a thriller with horror elements and action. Speaking of action, you are probably noticing a trend right about now. These games aren't survival horror games. They're action games. Now, the following games I'm about to mention took advantage of the horror/action zeitgeist that we experience within this generation. Games like Fear, Left 4 Dead, Clive Barker's Jericho, and Dead Rising are all games that overshadowed the horror genre on Xbox. That's not to say that these games are bad by any means, they really aren't. Valve's Left 4 Dead is an amazing game all around. The most notable thing about this game is its multiplayer slant. While the game does have a story, that's not what you, the player, are here for. You're here for the sheer terror of watching your friends be ripped apart. And while that is terrifying in and itself, once again, it's not true survival horror. Keep in mind, Left 4 Dead doesn't have to be that. That's not what I'm asking this game to be. What I'm trying to get across is that these are the games that suppressed real survival horror. Much like what the Monolith developer said about Condemned, multiplayer was all the craze this generation. Hell, Bioshock 2 had a multiplayer mode attached. Since online games were still in its infancy during the previous generations, a dimension of isolation left you, the player, intimately alone with the horror of whatever mysterious game you were playing at the time. But once the internet started finding its way into gaming, everything and everyone was connected, and things are less scary when there's more people around you. For an example, seeing a horror movie in the theater versus alone in your room is a completely different experience in and itself. There's a relationship media has that works in tandem with solitude, as well as when you are with company. Now that the internet was widespread throughout almost every household, gamers couldn't get enough of it. This in turn created many different social communities within game franchises, almost becoming its own form of social media in a way. But that's a topic I will touch on another time. So what am I trying to say? Not only was horror killed because of its cinematic linearity, or its action-focused coolness, but it was the online connectivity that killed survival horror. However, I would even go as far as to say that the main developers of the genre had a hand in killing it as well. Case in point, Silent Hill. I have already established in previous videos that Silent Hill has experienced its golden age during the 6th gen. However, during the latter half of the generation, there was a noticeable dip in quality upon the release of Silent Hill Origins as well as Homecoming. Speaking of Homecoming, let's dive into it, shall we? Silent Hill Homecoming was developed by Double Helix Games and published by Konami Digital Entertainment in 2008. The sixth installment in the Silent Hill series follows the journey of Alex Shepard, a soldier returning from war to his hometown of Shepherd's Glen, where he finds the town in disarray and his younger brother missing. As he continues his search to find his younger brother, he discovers more about the Insidious Order, which is the well-established cult in the series. On top of this, he also learns about the town's history and his own past. Konami felt the Silent Hill IP would fare better in the hands of Western developers, inevitably disbanding Team Silent, the original producers of the 4 main games. This decision ended up being disastrous, forever tainting the Silent Hill IP for generations to come. In fact, it's quite interesting that despite how revered Silent Hill is, most of the games range from terrible to mediocre. You could in fact argue that Silent Hill only has 2 great games, that being the first and the second, but that is subjective. Now, Homecoming isn't a bad game. In fact, it does a lot of things very well, namely the music, environments, and enemy design. But, controversially or not, this simply isn't a real Silent Hill game in my opinion. A year later, we would see another Silent Hill game release on 2 very different consoles, the PlayStation 2, but most notably the Wii. Silent Hill Shattered Memories was much of the same stock, another mediocre Silent Hill game that doesn't retain the same artistic merit as the original 4. This trend persisted with the release of Silent Hill Downpour in 2012. Alongside Downpour, we also saw the likes of Silent Hill HD Collection, so-called remasters of Silent Hill 2 and 3. Notwithstanding, upon the release of these games, they tanked horribly. The half-baked remasters featured high-resolution visuals, new sounds, new voices, trophies/achievements for both games, as well as Comic Sans. Silent Hill 2 includes the option to use both the old and new voices, however Silent Hill 3 only has the new voice track. This also marks the first time Silent Hill 3 was playable on an Xbox console. The collection got mixed to negative reviews due to the severe issues with both games, such as severe framerate problems, lockups, and a complete misunderstanding of the fog effect present within Silent Hill. While the PlayStation 3 version was quote-unquote patched, the Xbox 360 patch was cancelled and Konami offered refunds to all 360 owners of the game. Needless to say, Silent Hill was on its last leg, and died only 3 years later due to Konami and Kojima's falling out. The series has since been in the process of a resurrection, but yet it remains to be seen whether or not these new games will live up to the originals. And so concludes the story of Silent Hill, at least for now. Following the success that was the PlayStation 2, Sony was untouchable, or so they thought. The PS2 is still the best-selling video game console of all time, having sold over 155 million units worldwide. This leads us into the genesis of the PS3, aka what you would call a tragedy. There was a stellar lack of good launch titles. The console was ridiculously overpriced, and the unique cell architecture, which was expensive to develop for, contributed to the lack of widespread adoption at launch. Only hardcore fans or dumb brains would have purchased the PS3 at this time, but unlike anything we've ever seen in gaming before, the PS3 did a full 180. In 2008, the console went under revision that removed backwards compatibility with the PS2 and reduced the price to a much more affordable level. Sony also hammered out so many great first-party exclusives, it was ridiculous, including but not limited to Uncharted, Killzone, Resistance, Little Big Planet, Infamous, God of War, Sly Cooper, Demon's Souls. I think you get the point. The PlayStation 3 is my favorite console of all time, and luckily for us, the console wasn't shy of horror games, despite many of the games facing the same fate as that of the Xbox 360. However, the PS3 had a little bit more going for it. Like Silent Hill, Resident Evil also had a noticeable dip in quality during this generation. Two rail shooters, Resident Evil The Umbrella Chronicles and The Darkside Chronicles, were released for the Wii in 2007 and 2009 respectively. Both games received average reviews, with some people citing that the only thing scary about these games is the dreadfully shaky camera. Later, these games were ported to PS3. In addition to these ports, we also saw the likes of Resident Evil Code Veronica, the remake of the original game, Resident Evil 0, and Resident Evil 4. On top of that, the PS3 could also play original PS1 classics of Resident Evil 2, and Resident Evil 3. Needless to say, the PS3 is a Resident Evil machine. However, we did not get a brand new Resident Evil game until the release of Resident Evil 5, a solely third-person shooter developed and published by Capcom. The gameplay of Resident Evil 5 is similar to that of Resident Evil 4, but is the first in the series to feature two-player cooperation. Resident Evil 5 is also the first in the series to fully diverge from the survival horror genre, while still retaining the classic RE look. The plot involves an investigation of a terrorist threat by Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance agents Chris Redfield and Sheva Alomar in a fictional region of West Africa. Chris discovers that he must confront his past in the form of an old enemy, Albert Wesker, as well as his former partner, Jill Valentine. At the time, Resident Evil 5 was praised for its graphics, gameplay, and soundtrack, and these aspects are still deserving of recognition today. However, as time passed, fans of the series really seemed to pick this game apart for being the game that changed Resident Evil forever. Its nonsensical writing and mindless action deflated the series' reputation as the pinnacle of survival horror. While it's still a great horror shooter, RE5 is widely considered one of the worst entries in the entire series. 2012 was an eventful year for Resident Evil. Fans were introduced to two new spin-off games as well as a new mainline entry. RE Revelations was initially a Nintendo 3DS exclusive, but it was later released for modern consoles in 2013. Despite returning to its survival horror roots, the game retained the action the series had become known for. Set shortly after the events of Resident Evil 4, the game follows counter-terrorism agents Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield as they attempt to uncover the truth behind the bioterrorist organization that plans to infect the Earth's ocean with a virus. The game received generally favorable reviews and was followed by a sequel in 2015. Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City, on the other hand, was a little more controversial. REOPC was a squad-based third-person shooter developed by Microsoft Windows, PlayStation 3, and Xbox 360. The game was co-developed by Six Slant Games as well as Capcom, and is set around the same time as Resident Evil 2 and 3, featuring characters from those two games. However, it is a non-canon hypothetical scenario. The game follows a group of elite paramilitary mercenaries for the Umbrella Corporation during the zombie outbreak in Raccoon City. Critically, this game was ripped to shreds for its poor design, inferior action, and narrative missteps, although it is still considered a decent game overall. Then, in October of that year, arguably the worst entry in the entire franchise was released, the infamous Resident Evil 6. Players control Leon S. Kennedy, Chris Redfield, Jake Muller, and Ada Wong as they confront the force behind a worldwide bioterrorist attack. The story is centered around their 4 interwoven campaigns, each of which has a unique style in both tone and gameplay. While it's still a great action game on its own, RE6 felt like a slap in the face to longtime fans. The game was riddled with quick-time events, horror was essentially abandoned, and the story was a convoluted mess. During the 7th generation of gaming, Resident Evil declined despite the unwavering commercial success. Trust was almost completely broken between developers and the fans, and it would be a slow climb to get the series up to a point where it was revered as much as it once was. Both pillars of the survival horror genre had all but collapsed, but fortunately, a new game emerged from the rubble that would soon perfect the genre: 2008's Dead Space. Dead Space is a 2008 survival horror video game developed by EA Redwood Shores, later to be known as Visceral Games. The game was released in 2008 for PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Microsoft Windows. It is the first entry in the Dead Space series. Set on a defunct mining spaceship called the Ishimura, players take control of engineer Isaac Clarke as he navigates the spaceship and fights deadly monsters known as necromorphs, while also struggling with growing psychosis. Gameplay involves exploring different areas, solving environmental puzzles, and finding ammunition and equipment to survive. One of the most notable aspects of Dead Space is its return to survival horror roots. You play as a simple engineer using tools to escape, rather than a bulked up super agent. Dead Space was pitched in early 2006, with an early prototype running on Xbox. Its creator, Glenn Schofield, wanted to make the most frightening horror game he could imagine, drawing inspiration from Resident Evil 4, as well as films such as Event Horizon and Solaris. The team aimed for innovation and realism in their design, including features such as procedural enemy placement, as well as removal of HUD elements. The sound design was in particular focus during production, with the score by Jason Graves designed to evoke tension and unease. The game is known to be a masterclass in art design, level design, gameplay, and atmosphere. In fact, many would cite Dead Space as one of the best video games of all time, as well as the objectively best survival horror game of all time. So what happened next? Well, Dead Space's sales started off fairly slow but climbed its way up, eventually proving its potential to EA. It was followed by a rail shooter on the Wii in 2009, a spin-off action puzzle game in 2010, a sequel in 2011, and a third entry in 2013. Dead Space 2 was another successful entry for the series, but unfortunately it sold considerably less than anticipated. Following Dead Space 2, Dead Space 3 was an unsatisfying entry into the series, with many citing its notable plot holes and linked to be extremely disappointing, which provided EA with an excuse to kill the struggling franchise. The IP was shelved and Visceral Games disbanded. The series remained dormant until it was announced in 2021 that a remake of the first game would release in 2023. Dead Space is a clear-cut example of why survival horror died during this generation. They weren't wanted by the general public. While many people considered Dead Space to just be a good game at the time, in modern days, almost everyone agrees that it was an exceptional piece of art and the best of its generation. Dead Space set an extremely high bar for survival horror games in a generation that almost had nothing else to offer. Hopefully, with the release of the remake, the series will have a second chance to start again. The last game that had significant impact on the horror genre and the video game landscape was Naughty Dog's instant classic, The Last of Us. In terms of perfection, this game almost defines that term. Everything it does ranges from stellar to simply perfect, and it is not only a thought-provoking horror action game, but quite possibly the best video game of all time. Entirely subjective, but of course you cannot deny that this game is nothing short of exceptional. Now perhaps this is a cheap entry on this list. The Last of Us is technically not a survival horror game, but I would beg to differ. The game has scared me shitless on multiple occasions. I mean, just take the hotel basement scene for example. While the big horror stars of the previous generation fell, it was up to other developers to pick up the pieces. Visceral did what they could with Dead Space, but it seems that every other developer made an action game with horror elements. Arguably the best breakout horror hits of this generation were not prevalent on console. Of course, I am referring to the indie boom of the 7th generation. Xbox Live Arcade, PSN indies, and most importantly, PC indies. What big devs like Capcom and Konami failed to realize is that less is more when it comes to horror. Those OG survival horror games are only scary because that's all they could be. Games about survival in a mansion or a spooky town, not punching a boulder in the middle of a volcano. Games like Outlast, Amnesia, and Oni are just a taste of the greatness this generation experienced, even if some of these games aren't all that great. So, like we always do, let's take a look at some of the games that define this era of horror. Limbo is a 2D puzzle platformer developed by an independent studio, Playdead, and originally published by Microsoft Game Studios for Xbox 360. Interestingly enough, this game was supposedly going to be on PSN first, but Sony wanted to claim over the IP, something Playdead wasn't comfortable giving up, causing them to go to Microsoft for them to publish the game. Limbo incorporates a physics system that governs environmental objects and the player character. The player guides an unnamed boy through dangerous environments and traps as he searches for his sister. The developer built this game's puzzles expecting the player to fail before finding the correct solution, dubbing the style of play as trial and death. The horror in this game is found within the gruesome deaths you, the player, put the boy through, but horror can also be found within its atmosphere, as well as the unsettling sound design. The game is presented in black and white tones using lighting, film grain effects, and minimal ambient sounds to create an eerie atmosphere. Journalists praised the dark presentation, describing the work as comparable to a film noir and German Expressionism. Based on its aesthetics, reviewers classified Limbo as a tried and true example of video games as an art form. Lone Survivor is an independent survival horror game developed by one person, namely Jasper Byron. Byron directed, produced, designed, programmed, and composed the soundtrack to this awesome horror game. Players take control of an unnamed young man in a surgical mask who's been isolated in his apartment complex after an outbreak of a strange virus. This virus turns the world's population into aggressive, shambling mutants. Lone Survivor received positive reviews from critics, with most reviewers praising the game for its storyline and gameplay. The game was released on PSVITA and PS3 in 2013, and a remake of the game dubbed Super Lone Survivor was released very recently, in October of 2022. Slender, the 8 Pages, is a free-to-play indie-developed first-person survival horror game that was released in June of 2012 for Microsoft Windows and Mac OS X. The beta was developed by Parasite Studios using the Unity engine, and is based on the quasi-folklore meme figure known as Slender Man, a tall humanoid creature wearing a black suit and tie with a white face with no facial features. Slender Man originated as a creepypasta created by Something Awful forum user Eric Knudsen in 2009. Some publications noted the effectiveness of the game's minimalist horror approach, contrasting it with many action-based survival horror games of the time period, such as Slender gained a cult following through the various Let's Players that decided to share this game with their fanbase. The game boosted the popularity of the creepypasta, resulting in a pretty big controversy that led parents to be more attentive to the things their children were looking at on the internet. Slender's popularity spawned several imitations and fan games, however they varied in quality. A reimagining was released 1 year later, named Slender The Arrival, and in 2022 a remaster was released entitled Slender Reborn. However, while on the topic of virality, allow me to explain just how important these games were to the early Let's Player scene. Games like Slender led to some of the biggest YouTubers on this platform to gain popularity, thus introducing a wide audience to the wacky world of indies. The Let's Player-developer relationship offered various benefits to both the player and the creator. Now allow me to rattle off some of the most popular. Amnesia: The Dark Descent is a survival horror adventure video game developed by Frictional Games and released in 2010. The game features a protagonist named Daniel exploring a dark and foreboding castle called Brennenburg, while trying to maintain his sanity by avoiding monsters and unsettling events. Amnesia is most commonly associated with PewDiePie, as it was one of the main series that propelled him to subsequent popularity. Pewds used the iconic monster as imagery for the channel, and during his playthrough, such characters like Stefano's brother Gonzalez, and the infamous barrels came into fruition. Five Nights at Freddy's is a 2014 point-and-click survival horror video game developed and published by indie developer Scott Cawthon. The game takes place in a fictional family pizzeria called Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, where the player takes the role of the security guard who must defend themselves from the restaurant's animatronic characters that become mobile and homicidal at night. Who am I kidding? You already know all about this game. FNaF is most commonly associated with Markiplier, who released a fateful video 8 years ago entitled Warning: Scariest Game in Years, Five Nights at Freddy's Part 1. As of December 2022, this video is actually currently sitting at 106 million views alone. Markiplier is largely one of the people responsible for this franchise being as big as it is today. Outlast is a 2013 survival horror video game developed and published by Red Barrels. The game revolves around the freelance investigative journalist Miles Upshur, who decides to investigate a remote psychiatric hospital named Mount Massive Asylum. This game is most notable in part due to the severe amount of jump scares that are present within this game. Many Let's Players played this game, but the one I most commonly associate with this game is Jacksepticeye, who released his first episode of the playthrough 9 years ago in December of 2013. Now, listen, I can go on and on about the millions of games that were played by these YouTubers, but let's be honest, they aren't all that great. Part of the enjoyment was watching someone else experience a shitty game, so not only do you get to experience the game for free, but you also get a screaming man in your ear while you're at it. My point being that this period in time was huge for shaping internet culture, as well as the indie scene. There's a symbiotic relationship with these indie devs, as well as the Let's Players. The Let's Players would buy the game and share it with their audience, possibly exposing millions to a small passion project that was most likely created by one person alone. This, of course, not only let these people see and enjoy your game, but they will want to try it out themselves, leading to thousands of kids and teens to spend money on your game. From there, you can make more games and more videos will be made. With the money you, the dev, have garnered, you can merchandise your game to sell millions of figures, shirts, plushies, and whatever the hell these are. Like it or not, this was a big part of many childhoods, mine included. I fondly remember watching PewDiePie play these dumb little games, and I for one am glad that I did. No matter how cringe this shit was back then, you cannot deny its impact. And so I leave you with the death of survival horror during the 7th gen, but also the rise of indie horror. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this content, please, feel free to watch my other videos and, like, comment, share, subscribe, do whatever, you know the gist. You're on YouTube. If you want to follow me on other platforms, I am on Twitter at Landon's Boredom, and then you can also find me on Instagram at Landon Hansen with an N attached to each, at the end of each name. I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.